So welcome everyone. We're going to get started here, and today we're talking about FEMA Map Basics. And I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the State Floodplain Manager. And Mary Presnail, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yep. Hi, I'm Mary Presnail. I'm a floodplain hydrologist here at the DNR. Welcome, everybody.
And we'll be co-presenting here today, but welcome everyone. So today, the main topics that we're going to be talking about are some of the history of the FEMA maps, definitions, and then we'll be moving into more details on using the maps and how to find the maps and the updates that we're doing. Yeah, Mary will be talking a lot about some of our ongoing updates of the maps. And we want to make sure we save some time, the last 15 minutes at least, to talk about letters of map change. So the history of FEMA maps. The very first maps came out not long after the program was enacted in 1969. In the 70s, they were coming out with what they were calling the emergency program maps. So they were quick and dirty map. This is a full section here, so mile by a mile. They are not very detailed at all. Unfortunately, some of our communities still have this version of the map, but by the 80s, we were getting the first generation of the more detailed maps. Those maps and maps nowadays, they have a flood insurance study if they've got any detailed study areas. And the first set of maps had a FERM, a flood insurance rate map, and a separate flood boundary and floodway map. And the FERM map looked like this. It had the floodplain and it had base flood elevations, 100-year flood elevations just shown at the foot intervals. And I want to point out that the main floodplain is this zone A, the dark gray shaded area, that 1% annual chance flood area. That first set of maps, they would have a number. And that number was basically the number of half feet between the 10-year and the 100-year flood elevation, because they thought that the insurance side would look at, is it closer? Is it a small number between the 10-year and the 100 years, or a bigger number? And they thought they would use that for insurance purposes. Turns out they didn't. So these are only in the maps from the 70s into like 87, 88 range. The B zone is what we refer to now as the shaded X zone. And that B zone is usually the 500-year floodplain. In more recent maps, that B zone can also be the 100-year floodplain that's less than a foot deep, or that's draining less than a square mile. And it also can be areas that are protected by some kind of flood control project. And then the C zone is what those earlier maps called that unmapped area, the lower risk area. And so this was the insurance product, but then they had a separate map, this flood boundary and floodway map, where they had the cross sections that are associated with the modeling supporting the map, the floodway. And we won't get into a lot of detail on floodways in this presentation today, but if you've listened to our other floodplain regulation basics, the floodway is the area that we're very restrictive for our floodplain regulations. So them making this white was a problem because there were communities that didn't realize that was the really restrictive area because it was white, and the low risk areas were white also. So they did make improvements in the future. But the other part of the packet there is the flood insurance study. So especially if there was detailed information on the maps, there would be this flood insurance study. And most of our existing flood insurance studies are this older version with this old picture on here. If you haven't looked at the flood insurance study for your community, it is valuable to read through it. They talk about some of the background of flood issues in the community. They talk about the engineering methods used, and that's where we've got the specific data on flood levels for, in most cases, they had the 10-year, 50-year, 100-year, and 500-year. For those streams, rivers where we've got detailed studies, they're going to have a floodway data table. And those tie into the cross sections on the maps. They've got data for each of those cross sections. We'll get into some of this, but in general, the parts that for regulatory purposes we're looking at would be that regulatory column, and that may or may not include impacts from backwater of a downstream river, like if a stream's going into the Mississippi or the Minnesota River, there may be backwater and you want to be using this regulatory column. But then these columns show the difference, if there is a difference between the with a floodway established and without a floodway established. So with a floodway, without a floodway, and what that stage increase difference is. I should have picked one with more differences here. But when we're calculating our Minnesota lowest floor requirement, we take the base flood elevation plus a foot of freeboard plus this stage increase, if there is that. The other part that's in that flood insurance study are the flood profiles. And those flood profiles will show they'll wag the river bottom. It'll show the 10-year, the 50-year, the 100-year, and the 500-year information. So again, this floodway data table is focused on the 1%, the 100-year flood elevation, and gives that data. But if you wanted to see the information for your 10-year, 50-year, and 500-year, 10-year, 50-year, 500-year, then you would go to the profile. And then if you've got sites between cross sections, you'll want to look along that profile to get a more accurate determination of the flood elevations. But then we went into the late 80s and beyond. And again, they realized that it didn't make a lot of sense to have that information on two different maps. So they put it all on one map. The floodway is now shown with the hatching here, so that people don't throw out one of the maps by mistake. And they did change the terminology to, they still were calling the detailed study area the zone A, but they just put an E, that it's got a detailed study. It's got an elevation on the map. They took away the numbers. And they started calling the 500-year area the shaded zone X, and the lowest risk area where it's not mapped, the unshaded zone X. And this is an example of the paper maps that we had through the beginning of the 2000s. So then the third generation came. We started seeing in the mid-90s, we started seeing countywide maps being done. And before that, those paper maps, they would have separate maps for each of the cities. And then for the unincorporated counties, they would have that, but they would have area not included when you were looking at the city areas. And with cities doing annexations and things, that gets to be problematic. So they realized, gee, we should really have this all in one countywide map. And it depended on the situation. In some cases, they did have new hydrology, hydraulics, better topo information, so they could do better boundaries. But in some cases, they were not such great improvements. And we did have this joke in here about are we going to learn about how to refold maps? As more and more of the state gets these newer digital maps, we don't have the paper maps anymore. So that gets to be a lost art. But the newest maps that are being done, this is what the boundaries look like on FEMA viewers and on the newer FEMA map panels. The floodway has the hatching still, but it's this blue and red color. The AE, again, the areas where we've got elevations on the FEMA maps, that's this light blue. Our medium risk area, the shaded zone X, is this brownish orangish color. And the low risk area is still not, doesn't have any shading at all. And again, the floodway area, we're going to have very restrictive regulations. Flood fringe, you're going to go with whatever your underlying zoning is, and we'll have regulations to reduce the risk for anything that is allowed there. But again, some of those earlier digitation efforts, they were what we call digital capture. They literally just took the shape that was on the old paper map and they laid it into the digital format. And this is a good example showing that it did not follow the topographic information that we had by that time, and that we have better topo information now. And this was a little thing that Kansas provided to us. It's a joke, but noting that sometimes the FEMA maps can give you problems, and they noted an advertisement for Rolaids here. So going on, we are into the next generation that we are seeing. It's digital, it's one map, it's countywide. We're using the LiDAR for the boundaries with the newer efforts. And so when they get remapped, they use those boundaries. You've got better boundaries that make sense. They follow the contours we see that are derived from the LiDAR. And in the most recent mapping, the A zones, even if they're not a detailed study area, they've got some supporting modeling or analysis. And we've added a couple flood frequencies, and we have more non-regulatory products. And Mary will get into that a bit more. But for those who aren't familiar with LiDAR, you do have the plane that shoots down the light, and they know the speed of light, and they're able to get some really nice information on the ground elevations and the newer maps that then follow contours here and make more sense. And this slide just gives an update of where we are in terms of the latest collections of LiDAR.
Yep, thanks. So Ceil gave a nice overview of the history of those flood maps through when they started going to the digital format. In 2009, FEMA changed the process for updating these maps to what's now called Risk Mapping, Assessment, and Planning, or Risk Map program. And previously, there wasn't a whole lot of upfront scoping and coordination with communities before a project was started. And the Risk Map program tried to change this. It's now more of a collaborative approach, generally at a watershed scale, to improve public awareness of flood risk and provide quality data. So the image here shows the overall risk map process that generally starts with discovery, moves through to analysis and mapping, preliminary flood map release, and then eventually to map adoption. And the Minnesota DNR is a cooperating technical partner with FEMA, and we receive funding from them to perform some of the risk map program work here in Minnesota. So I'll now go over more information on the recent and current risk map work in Minnesota. So a process called discovery is usually the start of the risk map process. It focuses on partnering with other federal and state agencies, as well as local communities and non-governmental stakeholders to determine the mapping needs, generally on a watershed scale, but some are down on a countywide level. So one key component to this process is data collection, particularly from local agencies and communities. And the data collected is analyzed to help determine new study or mapping needs. Watersheds are generally prioritized if there's a large change in hydrology, development, or other factors, or if the counties have older maps or data or are unmapped. So here you can see some of the more recent discovery projects that have been completed around the state in the last decade or so. And hopefully some of you on the call have been involved in one or more of these projects. So sometimes we do discovery just on a county basis, either because we don't need to do the entire watershed or to finish off a portion of a county that has had some of it already completed as part of a watershed project. We did recently complete discovery for a portion of Becker County outside of the Otter Tail River watershed, and also Polk County. Additionally, FEMA's contractors are also performing a discovery project in Wadena County, and they're also doing a large-scale two-dimensional base level engineering modeling project in the Lake Superior area in the northeastern part of the state. And once that large 2D modeling project is completed, discovery projects will likely be funded for portions of that area, especially in Cook and Lake counties as they're currently unmapped. So once discovery is completed, FEMA may fund projects to move on in the risk map process based on needs identified from stakeholders. So we've had several counties that have already moved on to map adoption following discovery. Currently, we have funding for a few counties to move to that step 2 of the risk map process. And our current projects that are in the analysis and mapping phase are portions of the Twin Cities Huck 8 watershed, which is the pink line on the screen there. And then also for portions of Anoka County that are outside of that, the Twin Cities Huck 8 watershed, just so Anoka is going to be completely updated. So note that these counties don't yet have funding for DFIRMs or preliminary maps, but we're hoping that once we complete this phase that will be funded for the next. So we have had several other counties that are currently further in the risk map process. Itasca and St. Louis counties went effective in March of 2025, and several others will hopefully be finalized in the next year or two. Murray and Aiken County went prelim last September, and Chippewa County had preliminary maps issued in December of 2022. And we anticipate revised preliminary map panels late summer and early winter of 2026. Rock County will also have revised preliminary maps for areas in and near the city of Laverne, and those are projected to go prelim in August of 27. So how long does this whole risk map process take to get new FEMA maps? It can vary, but generally speaking, it takes around 2 years to go through discovery. Then if a county is funded by FEMA to move forward in the modeling and mapping process, that usually takes another 4 or 5 years to go through that whole process. So all in, it's not a short time to get new maps. It can usually take around 4 or 6 years or more until there are new effective FEMA maps. And there have also been recent lapses in funding, which has caused larger gaps in time for some of those projects. So FEMA has also started to fund the DNR to perform what's called a Better Data Letter of Map Revision. And this essentially is a smaller standalone project that revises a small area of the map if there are concerns over modeling or mapping. This can be especially helpful in cases where they don't want to hold up an entire county from getting their new effective maps, and can be done shortly after a county goes effective. So we currently have 2 of these funded for, one is the Rainy River in Koochiching County, and then one for portions of the Cedar River watershed in Dodge County. And we also recently completed these for one in Cottonwood County and Wilkin County. So these are really nice, relatively quick projects to get those areas updated. So if you aren't sure where your county's at in the process, we do have a full list of estimated map status by county on our website with the link here if you'd like more information on that. We also have a nice graphic available on our website to quickly visualize where the counties are at. So the smiley faces here all show the new maps that have come out recently or will be out soon. We do have a few counties that are still unmapped or in the paper map format, but we're making progress in getting all counties updated to digital maps. As we've shown, the FEMA maps have evolved since they first developed and will continue to change and improve as technology improves. FEMA's Future of Flood Risk Data initiative seeks to improve the state of mapping. This adopts a more probabilistic risk-based approach to displaying graduated data. So it's not an in or out hard line. It's, graduated data with more information on depths and things like that. So stay tuned. And I think here we're going to start getting into some of the key definitions. And Ceil, I think we're going back to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mary. So I've already been using some of these terms, but just a reminder that these are essentially synonymous terms. The 1% annual chance flood elevation, the 100-year. In FEMA documents, they refer to that as the base flood elevation. We'll talk about BFEs a lot. If you look in the state law, we do mention 1% or 100-year in there in some places, but we also use the term regional flood. So just be aware of that. When you're talking with the lenders or insurance people, they talk about the special flood hazard area. So that's that mapped A zone or V zones in the coastal areas. And in general, we'll sometimes just call it the high risk flood areas. I mentioned earlier that the initial detailed studies, these were the frequencies that they calculated was the 10, 50, 100-year, 500-year. But the 100-year, the 1% annual chance flood is the regulatory elevation. And I'm going to catch myself using 100-year a lot. We're trying to use probabilistic terminology because when people hear 100-year, they get it in their mind that if they have a big flood, they're good for another 99 years. And that is definitely not the case. The newer efforts, they've started adding in a 25-year flood elevation, the 4%, and something called the 100-year plus. Because when they calculate the 100-year, they're looking at a range of values and they take the middle of that range, the median value for the regulatory information. But we take the top of that range, the 95 percentile, to come up with the 100-year plus, and that's something we're looking at in terms of possible risk and comparing that to the 500-year where we've got that data. And a reminder of what the zones are. We've been talking about the detailed study in the map history, the detailed with the elevations on the maps, or the older versions where they use numbers. There's zone AO, which is an overland flow kind of area, and the maps will just show a depth of flooding, 1 foot, 2 foot, or 3 foot of depth. And we treat those differently. If you have any AO zones, we'll want to talk with you separately about how to regulate those areas. And AH are more of a basin, kind of a hole in the ground. They do have elevations on the FEMA maps. The zone A's we refer to as approximate zones. They don't have the elevations on the FEMA maps, but we've got more and more good data supporting our A zones now than in the past. We do have the coastal zones on the St. Louis maps that just became effective last year. And zone D, we have in a few counties, and it's basically the whole panel is referred to as the flood risk hasn't been determined, and they just call it zone D. And that those of you in Olmsted, Itasca, St. Louis that work with those areas, we'll talk with you separately on what that means. And just to give you a feel for the state, a lot of the mapping in the state is that approximate A zone, where again, we've been trying to get better data that's available to you guys, but that would not necessarily be on the FEMA maps. Some of the most recent A zone stuff actually is showing up on the FEMA maps, but that's unusual. And the detailed is pretty much in the metro and along some of our bigger river areas where we've had more risk over the years. Talked about the floodway versus a flood fringe, and we'll just do a quick review here that they realize that not all of the floodplain should be treated the same. And so right from the beginning, the Fed said, we're going to divide it into the floodway, which is the stream itself, and that faster and deeper part of the floodplain where we're especially concerned about the risk and flood damage. And we want to keep obstructions out of that area, because if you fill or you put buildings in there, it's going to cause increases that impact other people in the floodplain. And the flood fringe is the rest of that area. And they calculate that by looking at, again, where is that stream, where's the main area we need the flows to go. And they simulate that it's all filled in the flood fringe. So they'll run the modeling, get that base flood elevation without that filling, and they determine where that floodway is going to be, and they redo their cross sections in their models and pretend that flood fringe is all filled in. They run the model again. Of course, as you're squeezing in the area available for floodwaters to go, it makes the water levels go up, that stage increase here. Federal law says that can't be more than a foot. And in Minnesota law, right from the beginning, we limited it to half a foot. And we've got wording that says you can't increase flood damage potential, which we interpret as it can't impact any existing buildings. So if there's already existing buildings in or right next to the floodplain, you can't cause any rise. And so they get that calculated and put that into the study and the information in that floodway data table I was showing earlier. So the other thing to be aware of is that we're starting to see more unsteady and 2D models. And here's an example of what the floodplain used to look like in this area of Duluth. It just showed this kind of stream area going through the neighborhood. But that's not the reality. When they have flooding, a lot of the flooding breaks out, a lot of it was going down the streets. And so it got remapped here. And so the main stream is still going through here, but it's showing all these breakout areas and a lot more along the streams or the streets here, which is more accurate, but it does make things more difficult from a regulatory standpoint. And that's something we're starting to get more information, more guidance about how to handle that from a regulatory standpoint. But FEMA guidance is also evolving on that mapping. But that's definitely the direction we're going. One other key term that we use is our regulatory flood protection elevation. FEMA's requirement for the lowest floor is that it's at the base flood elevation, at that 1% chance elevation. In Minnesota law from the beginning, we recognize that, we're saying it's legal to cause up to half a foot of rise. We're going to take that into account because that's the real flood elevation. And we add a foot of freeboard for a safety factor. And that's our lowest floor requirement in Minnesota. For a little while, the freeboard requirement went away, but after the big floods in '97, it did get put into state law that was mandatory. So again, this is just showing those main zones, the floodway, the flood fringe that we were talking about, and on the newer maps, that same floodway, flood fringe. In the zone A's, it won't show a floodway, but in more and more of our state, we've got these supporting models. And so on DNR viewers, and you can get these cross sections from MinGeo Commons, but we've got the cross sections associated with those A-zone supporting models, and we call it the 1% annual chance water surface elevation because it's not officially a base flood elevation. It's not officially on the FEMA maps, but we use that as our best available data for our 1% annual chance flood, our BFE. In these cases, we just assume the maximum stage increase that you can have of half a foot. So we add the foot of freeboard, the half a foot of stage increase to the flood elevations here to get our regulatory flood protection elevation. In the regulations, we point out that we have to treat that as floodway unless an analysis is done to figure out where the flood fringe versus the floodway is. We'll talk about that a little bit more in our dealing with A-zones virtual training that we'll be doing on the 14th. And we are looking at making more training available to counties, SWCDs, watersheds in the future on how to open up those FEMA models that are used, the HEC-RAS models, and be able to look at what putting in new culverts or whether they have the right culvert information in there and some of that kind of stuff. And a reminder that the datum is important. It's a reference point, a mean sea level. It has changed over the years. Our old maps used NGVD 1929. Our newer maps are using NAVD 1988. And what you need to know is that the conversion between these two varies depending on where you are in the state. If you're in the southeast, the conversion's 0, so you don't have to worry about it as much. But as you go to the northwest, where the glaciers left the state more recently, that the ground is still rebounding, and we actually have a big difference, over a foot difference in those datums. So it's really important to know the datum when you're talking about flood elevations. Another way to think about this is it's kind of like Celsius versus Fahrenheit, that you're not changing the ground elevation, but you're using a different reference. So here we're trying to show that we didn't change where that building is, but if you're looking at it in NGVD, it'll be 713 in this example and 714 in the newer datum. So how to find FEMA maps and helpful DNR sites. So how to find base flood elevations. If you've got a detailed study, you definitely use that flood insurance study and get the base flood elevations there. If it's an A zone, but you've got detailed information in your preliminary new maps, Mary mentioned some of the places where we've got preliminary new maps, that can be used as best available data once we've got them in the preliminary new maps. Otherwise, we've got our pink lines, our supporting A-zone models in much of the state. We sometimes can look at the mapping that is in the works. Maybe it's not at the preliminary stage yet, but we're far enough along in the modeling that we can give it as best available data once it's been through some minimum checks and things like that. And sometimes we'll use we've got watershed district or community local water management plans or modeling, and we can use that as best available data, or Corps of Engineer reports, or sometimes a previous letter of map amendment, and we'll talk about letters of map amendments at the end here. Or sometimes we can have someone apply for a letter of map amendment and say, hey, we checked with everybody else. There's no data available. Please calculate an estimated base flood elevation for this site. And FEMA, the contractors that do the LOMA reviews, will calculate a BFE if it's for an individual property. They won't do it for subdivisions. And I do want to mention that we will have a series of shorter videos available soon on determining BFEs. The first one is more what types of maps and floodplain do I have? And then we break it into finding BFEs depending on if it's a detailed zone or a zone A, and if it's a lake or water course, because the way you calculate it differs depending on those 4 categories. So just a couple resources. To find the official map, you go to the FEMA Map Service Center, and the main page there, you can put in the address. For the more recent maps, you'll get this digital view of the mapping. Unfortunately, for the paper map counties, we have to go other methods, but you can then click on this dynamic map thing here. And this is pointing out that you might need to zoom in and click right on the building you're interested in, because a lot of the times the mark will be where the mailbox is on the road or in the middle of the parcel or something. So you want to get your location right on the building, and then you're going to click on the dynamic map, which gives you the choice of printing a fermet, and you'll get the official fermet. So a flood insurance rate map, a little piece of that flood insurance rate map. They force it to be at the same scale as your official panels. You will get your little location drop wherever you chose. That will be the center of your fermet. They have all the legend and the date that you printed it and that kind of thing. If you do want to zoom it in or out, you would want to do it in this interactive map before you ask to make the fermet. We do have other information on the DNR's main site. If you go to the Minnesota Floodplain Management, this is our main page. We've got maps and technical resources. If you go there and choose Find Flood Maps, you'll see this overall map that shows the status for our mapping in the state. You can zoom in and see the map a little bit better. I will point out that we do have a link to a video, about 20 minutes, on Is My House in the Floodplain, where we step through how to use the FEMA site to make a fermet, both for the digital maps and for the older paper maps there. Those of you that have digital maps, sometimes you want to see the older paper maps because you want to see what map was there at the time a building was originally built, to see if there was any violation involved, or to know when they became a building that was in the floodplain, if it was in a more recent map or not. So this is what that video looks like. If you go to the Show More, it'll give you the timestamps if you want to jump, say, right to how to look at paper maps or get a little introduction to our MinTopo site. We do have a page where we show links if there's preliminary new maps, or if there's a work map of some type. Once in a while, we'll have some work maps. So like in this example here, Winona County doesn't have prelim yet, but FEMA does have this really nice draft work map. It varies with the particular counties and the viewers, but they'll usually have an option to change the transparency here, turn on different layers. So here I've turned on the aerial background and zoomed in a bit so I can see that draft information compared to the building I might be looking at. on our DNR lake and flood elevations online site. If you're not already familiar with that, that's definitely a site you want to become familiar with. I've been talking about our pink lines where we've got the supporting modeling information for much of the state. In fact, I should go back here, point this out in this map. All these pinkish scribbles on this map, that's showing the counties where we've got those pink lines. So you can see it's much of the state, we've got that better information available. If we go and look in our lake and flood elevations online site, that is one of the default layers that will show up there. So you can use that information as your best available data for the BFEs there. So, and that's, we label it as the estimated 1% annual chance water surface elevation, since it's not an official BFE on the map, but we do use that as our best available data for BFEs. And we purposely tried to use the same kind of symbology that FEMA has on their maps for the areas where we've got the digital newer FEMA maps. And the places where we don't have the digital maps, in many of those counties, we had what we call the unmodernized floodplain, sometimes referred to as the Q3 layer. And we do show the 100-year and the 500-year floodplain when we have that information and if we've got a floodway. We do have other layers that may or may not be on in the default view, like we've got parcels. We do have the official cross sections. We've got contours. You can turn off the 2-foot and just show the 10-foot if you want, but some really helpful stuff there. We've got different background layers. We've got some measuring tools. You can use this to get what your lat long is, and you can make maps. Oh, we've got the public water layer there also. So a lot of useful sites that, again, this will be in the slides when we send them out. And okay, good. Letters of map change. Basically, this is more of an oversight. We will be talking a little bit more in depth about the FEMA letters of map changes on February 11th. We do have the recording still from 22 when we last went into more depth about letters of map revisions and letters of map change, the LOMAs, LOMR-Fs that we're talking about. And we're working on a series of short videos on these same topics so that you can go and learn more about that in just the piece that you need to know about. But in general, here's a typical floodplain. And this is a digital map. It's got the light blue here. And we've got, this building that we can see the whole parcel is separate from the floodplain. But sometimes lenders, when they're looking at whether a building's in the floodplain, they might put a buffer and they might call that in. In this case, it's pretty easy to look at the FEMA map and show it to the lender and say, hey, my whole parcel is outside. I don't have the mandatory flood insurance requirement. And this is why people usually want to get a letter map amendment or letter map revision based on fill, is that if buildings are in or touching this 100-year floodplain, the special flood hazard area, and they've got a federally backed loan of some type, the lender must require them to get flood insurance. And if the folks are in the floodplain and they think it's erroneous, then FEMA's got the process to correct whether you're really in the floodplain or not based on actual elevations. So again, this one is out as shown on the official map, but sometimes lenders will call it in. This is another one that the building is out as shown, so it doesn't trigger that mandatory flood insurance, but this is likely to get caught as by the lender saying that it's in the floodplain because they tend to intersect the parcels with the floodplain, and this is on part of the parcel. But this is a situation where you could send the lender information showing it's out on the map and it's not actually mandatory. Whereas this building, okay, it's getting clipped and they won't be happy. They'll say, well, it's just little pieces. The main part of the building is out. they have to require the flood insurance if any part of the building is in or touching the floodplain. So this would definitely be called in for that mandatory insurance requirement. So we'll talk about the LOMA or LOMR-F process to show if that's actually high. There's the different types of methods that you can use to request that they change the zone for that property. You can send that better map information to the lender if it's clearly out. Sometimes the lenders will say, I want something official from FEMA. So then you can apply for what's called a letter of map amendment out as shown, where you submit the letter map amendment application, but you don't have to include any elevation information. They'll look more closely at the map and say, yep, we agree this is not in the mapped area, and here's an official document showing it's out as shown. And then we're going to talk about these three a little bit more in depth: the letter map amendment using LiDAR with a survey, and then the one involving fill that's called the LOMR-F. So again, if it's out, you can send them better maps. Note that the lender does have the prerogative to require flood insurance, but it's not a mandatory federal requirement if that's the case. And they should be eligible for a cheaper policy. It's not so much the case anymore with the new way that FEMA does the rating. But someone might then want to shop around and see what other lenders would say. So in this case, here's a copy of the FEMA, and you can see pretty clearly that it is not touching the zone A. If it's touching the 500-year, that medium risk area, that does not trigger the mandatory insurance requirement. They might be a good idea for them to get flood insurance because if they're in or touching that 500-year, that medium risk area, but it's not mandatory. And if it's not mandatory, they could choose how much coverage they want. Whereas with mandatory coverage, they have to get whatever the outstanding loan is for, or up to the $250,000 for residential building that's available. Whereas if it's not in the A zone here, if it's in the low risk area or the 500-year, you could choose, maybe I'll get 50,000 in coverage, because that's a part I think that would get damaged in a flood. Sometimes we suggest looking at the county sites because they've got better aerials, and having that supplement the FEMA maps. FEMA staff say, this is the official map. We will not use this instead of a FEMA map, but it can be helpful to support and help them to interpret what's in the aerial photos. So back to this situation, again, it is in the floodplain. It's touching the floodplain. So in this case, we want to look at, is it actually high? The letter of map amendment process is stating that we didn't do any filling, we didn't change anything on the land. The FEMA map just wasn't accurate enough. They didn't have good topo when they were doing it, and also just tenths of a foot might make a difference, and they aren't that accurate in the boundaries when they're drawing those. So this is intended for the situation where it's on a naturally high area, and it might be a little island, or it might just be as you're going up the slope from a lake or river that you're to that part that's a little higher. Another way to look at it from the side view here is, here's our natural ground, and they look at, is that lowest ground touching the building above the base flood elevation or not? If it is, they're eligible to apply for this letter of map amendment. And when we talk about natural ground, that's whatever the ground was on the date of the first map showing this in the floodplain. So say the buildings were built in the 40s or the 50s and they brought in fill at that time, that doesn't count as fill if it was done before the first map in say the 70s or the 80s. And even with some of them recent maps that new areas have been mapped, the natural ground will be based on what was there on the date of the first map. In many of our older buildings, they may have had basements. That was legal back then. If they're in a shoreland or in a floodplain more recently, we should not be seeing basements below the base flood elevation. They should be meeting our regulatory flood protection elevation. But if it's a pre-firm building, then they can still get a LOMA, but this will be a consideration if they go to do additions or major improvements. One thing that comes up once in a while is someone will be told they're in the floodplain because of a deck or the stairs, and they go to apply for a LOMA and the support of that attached deck is too low. They will be denied. They will not be removed with a letter map amendment. What they can do, and what we've seen some people do, is put extra supports next to the house, detach this. It can be really close, but it can't be attached. And this is why FEMA's concerned about those attached things. Is water comes along, you have a flood, it rips off the deck or that stairs, and it rips off that's attached to the building. It rips off more of the building. And FEMA apparently started seeing a lot more claims that were related to attached decks and stairs, and got a lot more strict about that probably 15 years ago. And then sometimes we'll see situations like this where you can see that the original contour would have been coming across like this, where the base flood elevation is. This building would have been above the flood elevation, but when they built the house, they dug it out and basically put the building into the floodplain because they wanted that walkout. So just be aware of that. Another thing we'll look at is there already a LOMA or a letter map revision based on fill? If there is, and it's the same building and they haven't done any additions, that's still valid and it carries with the property. There is FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer. You can go there, turn on the LOMA layer. Unfortunately, it's not on in the default. You'll see these purple dots. You can click on the purple dots and get a copy of the determination document. Moving on to situations where they may not already have a LOMA, but you know that the maps in that area are the old maps that did not have good boundaries. And we'll run into places where the building is, here's the lake, here's the floodplain boundary. It's kind of a little hard to see, but there's a red hatching here. It's showing this building in the floodplain, and you can see all these contours. It's 30 plus feet above the flood elevation. And so this is a situation where FEMA, it's been over 10 years now. When we started getting the LIDAR and having these contours available, we argued to FEMA that people shouldn't have to pay for a survey when they're tens of feet above the base flood elevation. And FEMA agreed, and we worked out this process where you look for the contour that's not touching the building and is below the building. There's a certain accuracy for the contour, so we subtract half the contour interval. So these are 2-foot contours, we subtract a foot. And if this contour minus a foot is above the base flood elevation, they can use that information, use this map to show that, and get a letter of map amendment without the survey. Otherwise, for a normal LOMA, they do need the survey by a licensed surveyor or a professional engineer. We have a video talking about how you can use the lake and flood elevations online site, because we have our 2-foot contours on there, and we step through how you might have to do 2 maps. Do one that's zoomed in to see that 2-foot contour here, and then you might need to do another where you zoom out so you can see the upstream and downstream cross sections and what you're using as the basis. But in the comment section, we call it the LIDAR leg. So that contour below the building minus a foot, that's something that the FEMA reviewers accept, that terminology. And we can show what the base flood elevation is in this example, because we've got the pink lines right on the maps. Here I zoomed out what we say in the comment section here. Okay, that should be showing a clip of the video, but we do have the newer video on creating LOMA with LIDAR maps that's available on our website. So if it is in, but it appears high, you can look at those things and look at the Mintopo viewer, get an idea of how high it is, whether if you get a surveyor out there, if you'll be able to show it's higher, still helps with better flood insurance rate, even if it's not high enough to get a LOMA. There's different ways to apply. You can do it with the paper, but it's a lot better to do it digitally, use the online application. And if you've got a licensed surveyor or professional engineer and they've gone through a process to be eligible to do e-LOMAs, that's one that you can get it once they've got the survey and submit it in less than a day, they can get it approved. Whereas normally FEMA's got up to 60 days to make that determination. They say usually it takes about 35 days or less, but this e-LOMA is an option. You can ask the surveyor, hey, are you eligible to do an e-LOMA? Because they can get them right away. If you do have to get flood insurance and you get a LOMA, you can get a refund afterwards for a good chunk of it. Some of the fees and surcharges won't get refunded. Talk quickly about LOMR-Fs. This is where you did do filling. The map was correct. It was a low area, but you've done filling. You've got the lowest floor and the lowest adjacent grade are meeting the local ordinance. They're above that base flood elevation or at or above the base flood elevation. This kind of a situation. Then you can apply for a letter map revision based on fill. The difference here is you give the lowest adjacent grade and you have to give the lowest floor elevation. You have to show that the lowest floor elevation is meeting that requirement. And the community has to fill out a community acknowledgement form. And when you fill that out, you're saying it's not in the floodway. If it's a conditional LOMR-F, that they're complying with the Endangered Species Act, that the lowest floor is reasonably safe from flooding, which if you're documenting that it meets your ordinance, it's meeting the regulatory flood protection elevation, that works. And if you're one of the few communities in the state that have adopted FEMA's Technical Bulletin 10, there's some other options. So when you're signing that, you're saying it meets your regulations. And this is something that they started to do in 2001, is having this, what we call the Technical Bulletin 10 option. And very few communities have that. If you want to learn more about that option, it's basically a way to get a LOMR-F, and then they can actually put in a dry flood proof basement after that. It has to be done in the right sequence, and we don't encourage that. So very few communities in the state have that option. That's the end of our presentation for today.